questions, if you would put them in the chat box. Also, within the different sections of the presentation, we'll be pausing to ask questions. And so if you have questions you prefer to ask yourself, we'll give you some time to do that as well. But thank you all for being here, and I'm going to pass the microphone over to Margaret and Julie. Thank you.
Here, so I bet you can hear us now. All right, very good. Howdy and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on this afternoon to talk about service animals. We put together, Julie and I put together a presentation. Let me see if I can advance the slide here. Maybe. And we have a couple of topics we want to cover. And you know, the topic of today's workshop is service animals. And you can see on the listing of the topics there that the service animals is kind of in the middle. We actually want to start with a little bit of background on what service animals are, why do we have them, some of the background with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so I know this is the last workshop in the series. And some of you may have been able to participate in more than one of them beforehand. You might have some of this background already, but we may have some folks on that have just now joining us and just want to know about service animals. So we're going to let Julie do a little bit of background and talk about that, so you get that background and that history, and we know what the regulations are. And then we can't just talk about service animals without talking about emotional support animals and our pets and some other things. And so we want to cover that as well. And then I know at the very last bullet on our topic list is just what are the guidance and stuff. We do have one slide that has just some links that you can use for resources. So we'll include that at the end. So you can always you know, leave the workshop and go and do some more reading if you want to do that. So let me, without further ado, I'll let Julie get started with some of the history and background about the Americans with Disabilities Act.
All right, well, thank you. So I'm going to start with a fun fact, which I thought was fun. I thought it was pretty interesting that Bush 41 and Bush 43, father and son, were involved in supporting the ADA rights. And that President Bush 41 on July the 26th of 1990 signed the American Disabilities Act into law. And at this point, or at that point, that was the most affirmative of rights for the disabled in American history at the time. So what did that bill do? It basically defined disability and covered a wide range of physical and mental disabilities. A bulk of the act provided legal assistance or legal recourse really against employers who discriminate against the disabled. And it set standards on how they could access public buildings and public accommodations. It also established the federal laws regarding service animals. So when that was all signed and done, Bush said, he's known for saying, let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down. So then Bush 43 continued on by signing the amendment. But the bill prior to the amendment had to do with public services and making them accessible, education, housing, public transportation, public accommodations like hotels and recreational facilities, restaurants, stores. It addressed telecommunications. 3 years after the bill in 1990 being signed off on, anyone who had or provided telephone services and provided vocal transmission services had to then provide non-vocal transmissions for the hearing impaired. It also addressed employment, which provided some access to jobs and reasonable accommodations for employees. So why was an amendment needed in 2008 and signed by Bush in 43? It was basically to broaden the definition of disability, because EEOC regulations and courts were narrowly interpreting the definition and in turn making it difficult for individuals to be protected under the statute when they were clearly disabled. So before 2008, courts were focused on individuals proving that they were disabled instead of employers complying with ADA. So at that point, court cases were in favor of employers like 90% of the time. So these amendments were necessary to clarify the definition of disability and protect our individuals with disabilities in employment situations and in the courts. So in short, the whole focus of the ADA was to provide equal access to services and programs and to jobs for our disabled population. So just, good work, guys. That's all I got to say about that. Okay, so what was the definition of disability? It's a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And there are way more major life activities than the 8 I provided there, but there's the major ones: walking, lifting, sitting, breathing, working, concentrating, hearing, are all ones that are probably the most prevalent that we see a lot. So that's the definition they came up with for disability. Okay, so when the bills were signed, Congress divided the ADA into 5 titles. So before we get to this slide, I want to tell you that the titles tell you about those titles because they differentiate the areas covered by the law. Title I was the first title that, and that spoke to employment and applied to private employers with 15 or more employees. It also applies to state and local governments and labor unions, but it was really talking about just the employment piece related to these private employers mostly. And it basically prohibited discrimination against such individuals and required employers to provide accommodations, reasonable accommodations. Title II is what we're covered up over, mostly Title II and not Title III. Title II is for public entities. So if you provide a service or a program, it must be accessible. Basically that in a nutshell. And public transportation was also addressed in Title II, making sure that it was accessible. Title III is public accommodations and commercial facilities, really having to do with our buildings, making sure that if we have newly constructed buildings, we build to the current code. And if we do renovations, we also, if something was inaccessible at that point, it should be accessible now and in accordance with the current standards, ADA standards. So, so it talked about mainly facilities. Now, it did also include like 12 different categories of public accommodations, one of them being education, nurseries, elementary, secondary, undergraduate schools, postgraduate private schools, and other places of education, but also lodging, restaurants, theaters, zoos, museums, gyms, and stuff like that. So they have a really good list of who needs to and who is covered under Title III. Title IV is telecommunications. Like we said before, anyone who is providing a telephone service with vocal transmissions had so much time to provide non-vocal transmissions for individuals with disabilities. And Title V was basically prohibiting retaliation against individuals who enforce their rights under the ADA Act. So, so those are the titles. So when you see Title II and Title III here, kind of understand that there are some different titles depending on who you are and what you have to comply with. Okay, so state and local governments, that's what we are. And because of that, we are prohibited from discriminating against disabled applicants and employees, prohibited from discriminating in an educational setting against qualified individuals with disabilities. We're required to provide reasonable accommodations, and it explicitly allows service animals to accompany individuals with disabilities in publicly accessible areas. So making sure that our educational opportunities, extracurricular activities, and facilities are open to all of our students who, with or without disabilities and with or without a service animal. Okay, so let's see. Reasonable accommodations. These are just ones we were talking about before. Things that we address every day is, you know, what kind of workplace accommodations, what kind of programs and activities accommodations can be set for those. Housing accommodations we'll get to a little bit later. Service animals can access any type of public area. Housing accommodations, we have some specific rules that have to do with Fair Housing Act, and we'll talk about those because that really has to do with emotional support animals. And public transportation, making sure our buses and our terminals are accessible, the telephone services, and we also do building standards and check out our buildings to make sure they're accessible. So those are the kinds of things we see here.
Good. Okay, on this next slide, if you want to include your answer in the chat, and just Christy, if you let me know if anybody can name this dog. Do we have any answers?
We do. We have Sully listed by 2 people.
All right, very good. They get the prize for the day. Yes, this is a picture, or actually a statue of Sully. Sully is the service animal for George Bush, our president, the 41st president. Sully is a 3-year-old Labrador, and he was matched with President Bush back in June of 2018. He served the president for a little over a year. In February of 2019, Sully went to be the facility service dog at Walter Reed Medical Center. Sully was commissioned with the title of Hospital Corpsman Second Class, and that was in honor of George Bush's military service in the Navy. Sully was specifically trained for President Bush to do certain tasks to help him with his daily activities. Also, he was a companion dog too, but he was specifically trained to do some things for him as he went through his daily activities. I don't know exactly what the specific task that he was trained to do, but he was. Sully, this statue is actually, and I haven't seen it, but I in the article I was reading is this statue was commissioned by Susan Barre, and I'm not sure if I said her name correctly, but she is based out of California, fairly renowned sculptor, and did this statue of Sully. And it is, I think, in December of 2019 was and unveiled at the George Bush Museum and Library here in town, here at College Station. So if you want to go see it, supposedly it was in the west side or west wing of the museum, so you can go see that. And Sully is in a position or stature in the retrieve stature, and that is where these group that trained Sully was the Veterans America Vet Dogs Association or group, and they train dogs to do fetching. So that's one of the tasks that Sully could do, is fetch things for his handler, President Bush. So it's pretty exciting. So that's going to be kind of the intro into, let's talk a little bit more about service dogs. Okay, let me advance the slide, and Julie, if you want to talk a little bit about the service dogs as a reasonable accommodations. You just talked about reasonable accommodations on that other slide.
Yeah, so are service dogs a reasonable accommodation? Yes, they are. The state of Texas has determined that service dogs are a reasonable accommodation if and when they meet the ADA requirements. So we're going to talk about what a service, how we define a service animal in just a bit. But the onus is not on the owner of the service animal or the handler to request that service animal go into a building. But other states are not like that. Other states can and do require others to, or people to request that they bring service animals in before they do. And so we don't have to worry about that. Got another fun fact, Title 1, employers do not have to allow a service animal in their workplace. When you work for a private employer, they can, and you have to officially request an accommodation in order to have a service dog accompany you for their disability. Private employers must take the request seriously. They can't just automatically deny it. They have to do the same type of scrutiny that you would with that we would have to do with any type of request for reasonable accommodation. And they can request certain information before they decide. Under Title I, though, this is the fun fact, service animals are not defined as only dogs or miniature horses, as they are in Title II and Title III. So the way I read this is employees can request other types of animals accompany them as service animals, because technically there's no limit to the type of animal that you can request. So I'm sure they get quite a few type of requests there. And I'm also assuming that if there is a service animal, they still have to be able to conduct or do a task or work for their handler or for their person. So I thought that was interesting. So Title II, as Title II and Title III, we do not prohibit service animals in areas in which the public can access. So yes, they're definitely a reasonable accommodation. That's already been approved.
Yeah, so Texas A&M, we are not Title I, we are Title II and Title III. So yes, we do allow service animals to come on campus and access wherever that person with a disability accesses.
Okay, so what is a service animal? How is it defined under ADA? So we define it, or ADA defines it as a dog or a miniature horse that has been individually trained to do work or perform a task for an individual with a disability. And we've already defined who an individual with disability is before. And that task or that work has to be performed, that's performed must be directly related to the person's disability. So it can't be, something else that a trick or anything. Then it has to be a task or some type of work. And that's
okay.
Yeah, that's good. So individuals with disabilities do not have to request permission to bring the service animal on campus, as we talked about before. They don't have to show any documentation, and they don't have to have their animal wear a service animal vest or a collar or a leash that's specifically marked as a service animal. You do see vests, and that's basically because the owner or the handler wants you to know that that animal is working. So, but they don't have to have that, and they don't have to show documentation. Some people will go online, look up, or there are services or companies out there that will, for a fee, you could request some type of certification that you have a service animal or an emotional support animal. And for $200, the cheap price of $200, you can get a certificate, but that's not needed. We don't ask for that. I don't know who would ask for that, but I know we don't, not with service animals. And I don't think we do, not type of certification from a company, or when we get to emotional support animals, we're not asking for documentation unless it's part of the request, so that they're letting us know that a doctor or physician has determined that an animal is necessary for that person. So none of those are required. Okay, service dog training. Peggy looked this up, and I was pretty amazed at the amount that we're about to talk about here. But cost, there are costs to breeding and training and placing a service dog with an individual with disability, and it can be over $50,000. It's an incredible amount. The training that these service animals receive can be formal, but it doesn't have to be. And it doesn't have to be done by a recognized trainer or a group. It can be by an individual, the handler or owner. If they can teach them how to do that task or that work, then that's perfectly fine. And in Texas, a service dog in training has the same access and the same rights as a service animal, as a service dog. So they're allowed in the same places. All right, so here's just a couple of animal tasks, retrieving items, picking up things that someone's dropped, opening, closing doors, bracing somebody, their handler, or alerting the handler when blood sugar levels drop. And there are probably tons more of tasks, but those are just a few to give you some examples.
And it's pretty amazing what dogs can learn to do. I mean, when you think about a dog opening a door or, you know, pushing down a door handle and being able to open it up for their handler, you know, picking up a credit card, you know, or something, hairbrush or pencil or something. I mean, those are pretty amazing things that these service animals can do, or service dogs can do for their handler. But it's a lot of things, I think, on this a slide. The one example that's on there is toward the bottom where Julie just talked about the blood sugar levels. And those are things that you don't see. You can't see there. The dog might just be sitting next to the handler and you don't see, but they are sensing when the blood sugar levels rise or drop, or when the heart rate is, you know, exceeding a certain amount or whatever that might be. So it's amazing that what the dogs can be trained to do. And that's really exciting, I think, for the handlers, for the persons with a disability. Here's a good question.
Okay, so how do you know when an animal is a service animal? If the disability is not apparent and you need to ask a question about to make sure that this is a service animal, these are the two questions you can ask. Is this a service animal required because of a disability? And what work or task has the animal been trained to perform? And that should tell you whether or not it's a service animal. If they say yes to the first question, and then they tell you what work or task they are doing, then they've told you all they need to, that you need to know. After that, you're not allowed to ask any more questions, ask for any documentation, require the animal to demonstrate the task, or inquire about the nature of the person's disability. So if you have questions as to the validity or possible misrepresentation, I would suggest you contact Disability Resources or our office, the ADA coordinator office, so that we can talk to you about it. But it's not to be investigated or addressed by your department or staff. We'll just get the details and we'll figure out what we do next. Let's see. Okay, so service animals are permitted to accompany their individuals in publicly accessible areas. We can't say that enough. I probably said that 5 times already. But the animals do have to be kept under control. So they have to be on a leash unless it prevents them from doing their task or their work. No barking or disruption of an environment or damage. And the owner or handler is responsible for damages, and they're also responsible for the dog's needs or the animal's needs. Water, food, whatever to go relieve themselves, the handler has to take care of that. Now, I see that no barking's on here. When you see that we're talking about barking, barking may be their task, you know, to alert their person if something's happening in their body and they need to be alerted. That's not the barking we're talking about. We're talking about someone or some animal that's being aggressive or just barking for no reason.
Being noisy.
Just being noisy. And typically that's what you might see on one that's not trained real well. So
So yeah, so we're talking about the publicly accessible areas. I want you to envision not just outside, in the common areas outside, but we're think about them as they enter a building on campus, or they're in the library on campus, or they're going into a classroom on campus, or even an office building. So the person with the disability is coming in with their service animal, their service dog, and the dog really must be kept under control. So if the dog is very jumpy, or like scratching on the walls or the carpets and stuff, those are things that you can say as an employer or as a professor, somebody that's in charge of that area can ask the person with the dog to remove the dog.
Right.
And you might be covering that a little bit later, I don't know.
Okay, so what areas might they not be permitted to access? So I probably should have put that before the first bullet, that this is always looked at on a case-by-case basis. We never say, if there's chemicals in a lab, you can't have a dog in there. You can't go in and like that. You've got to look at each situation differently. So if an area is a danger to an animal or a dog because of chemicals or limited space or something like that, that is a trigger for us to be able to talk to the person, the individual with the dog, to talk about those things. Is it a danger? Is it, let's just make sure that we're all on the same page so this animal doesn't get hurt. And then talk about how we can limit those dangers. Safety and our sterile environments. We have research labs. Some of them require PPE, so personal protection equipment. If our lab requires our student or our employee to go in there with goggles, then a service animal would need goggles. If they go in fully suited, then the animal would have to do that. It's not unreasonable to require that animal to do exactly what you're expecting a person to do, because they're having the same type of issues. You don't want exposure or to something in your eyes or on your person or on that animal's body. Medical facilities, if this is case by case too, if somebody's having surgery in a surgery room, then there's no animal allowed. If they are just laying in a bed waiting for treatment, then the service animal is allowed in there because other people are allowed in there too. Other animals. So the vet school, has horses. Most horses, I would believe, would be scared of dogs. So if that is the case and there's a safety issue, we don't want the dog to get hurt. We don't, even if that dog is very trained, the mere presence of that dog might be an issue for the safety of the horse or those other animals. And so we've got to look at all those situations individually and make sure that we keep everybody safe. And if we need to make some reasonable accommodations, then we will. So, but we look at those on a case-by-case basis. We never say no, but if there is something triggering, if you think that we need to talk about something, or you need to talk to some student or employee that has a service dog, then do it. That's what an interactive process is for, and it's good dialogue so that we keep everybody safe.
So it's just in summary to recap that, a service dog, and I will use dog because I know you can have a miniature horse, but I have not actually seen a miniature horse on campus, so I've only seen dogs. So I'm going to talk about service dog, that as a general rule, service dogs can go anywhere that their person, their handler goes. So if there are cases, and if you're working on campus or you're going to class here and there's a spot that we just don't think that the dog is going to be safe in, or something like that, that is by exception. And then, but as ADA coordinator office, we will look at those exceptions And we will do look at all options to try to figure out another way that the person with the disability can be served, have accommodations, something that will allow them to be able to still participate in whatever activity or program we have offering here at A&M. So we're going to do our best to see what can we do for either the animal or for the person or for the environment. Can we change the environment at all? We'll do our best to make sure that that person has access. When we talk about service animals, we do get in our office a lot of different questions. We get questions about, is this really a service animal? This person's bringing an animal and they're bringing it and they're looking like a service animal, but they're not 100% sure. And we do get questions in our office. I know Julia's fielded some and I fielded some about, and they'll say, hey, I want to get a service animal for my, son or daughter student that's coming to campus, and how do I do that? Does Texas A&M train dogs? Do you guys have a program to do that? And the answer we have to give is no. As a university, we don't have a program to train dogs to be service animals. We don't have a center or a department or college that does that. But because A&M has a lot of student organizations, and typically if there's a topic that we might have a student organization that would fulfill that topic, we do have at least two that I'm aware of, two student organizations that work with service dogs, and they're listed on the slide here. We have Aggie Guide-Dogs and Service-Dogs and Patriot Paws of Aggieland. Both of them work towards awareness of service dogs, and we work with training service dogs. So the second one there works with matching up service dogs with veterans. And I think that the main thing is too that these student organizations will also work on the training of dogs. And in one of the earlier slides, we talked about service dogs and training having the same access. So we have student organizations, students on campus that are they're training service dogs to be service dogs. And they might be at the very, very beginning stages of training. So they might be the puppy stage, and they're just working on the socialization part of it before they even go to the more formal training of learning a specific task. So you will see students and folks on campus that don't maybe have the appearance or their parents appearance of a disability. They could be service dogs in training, or they could be a non-apparent disability. So, but both those out there, and I just wanted to do a shout out for them. One of the things a couple of years ago, we had a lot of questions about dogs on campus and the mixing of, we have service dogs on campus, and that folks with service dogs were having a lot of questions and some comments and just maybe some things that weren't working as well for them as smoothly. And working with the two student organizations and working with our office and working with Christie's and that disability resources office, they were able to put together with student affairs a video. And I'm going to show you this video a little bit and just see if it will pop up here. Show you the video, and it talks about just kind of the etiquette when folks are dealing with or walking by or coming in contact with a person with a dog, service dog, or you're not sure if it is, but this is really from the perspective of a service dog, and it's actually from the viewpoint of the dog himself or herself. So the dog is having the comment. So I'm going to share that with you. It's a couple minutes long. Let me see if I can successfully show it. Let's see, where is it?
I think
down here
to the one to the right. Look, right there.
Okay, I'm going to see that. Christy, can you see this if I make it bigger? Okay, I'm going to play it. Hopefully that will show.
Just another day at work. What's that? Oh, it's just a human. I hope I don't get distracted because this could be dangerous for my human. Stop. You're distracting me from my work. That feels really nice, but I really have to get back to a little higher. That's the spot right there.
Keep fellow Aggies safe. Touching or interacting with a service animal can be dangerous or life-threatening.
Oh no, I can't concentrate. I need to be working. Great. No more distractions. Now I can help my human get through the day on campus. I smell a dog around. I hope it leaves me alone. Oh, don't hurt me. Oh, hello, how are you? Geez, you really surprised me there. It's okay if you're on campus, but please just walk by next time.
Consider leaving pets at home. Other animals can interfere with the work of a service animal and put your fellow students at risk.
What a stressful day. It may look like I'm just resting, but even while we're sitting on this bench, I have to remain alert and ready to react to keep my humans safe. I can see you taking pictures of me. I may not seem to mind, but it can be annoying and disruptive to my human. If only you could see what it's like.
Respect the privacy of the service animal team. Do not take photos or videos of the team without permission.
I can't even rest in peace. Everyone is always in my business. I couldn't see you enjoying this. Work is important to me, and while it may not be obvious that I'm working, I've spent hours training to be able to assist my human in a variety of tasks. Some of us can even alert our humans in the event of a medical emergency. One of our Aggie core values is respect, and we can show our service dog teams respect by practicing proper etiquette around them. It's always safe to assume that when you see a human animal team on campus, they are at work.
Hide it. All right, thank you for watching that. Really wanted to do like more of a public relations message, and just to let people know that when the service animals are working with their person, their team, as they say in the video, they really don't want to be distracted or interrupted. They are working, and we never know exactly what they're doing for the person. So, and this little chart here, or this chart here, is a nice reminder too. It's just the things that we're recapping from the video. This chart is on the Disability Resources webpage, and we talk about animals and some service animal etiquette. So it just recaps the things that we just saw in there about keeping the fellow Aggie safe and not interacting with the service dogs. And, you know, if you can, and, you know, we're such a large campus, and we have lots of different animals on campus, pets, emotional support animals, and of course supports or service animals, and they all interact, and we all want our dogs to be friends with the other dogs. But, you know, where we can, and we're at class and we're at work, and maybe leave your pets and stuff at home, that's always a safe thing to do. And just, you know, of course, with any animal, you would always ask permission to pet them or come up to them and talk to them and stuff. So especially if you see if it's a service animal, it's probably better not to ask if you can pet them and interact with them. And then the last bullet or last column on there is just to think of this service animal as a wheelchair, as an integral part of that person's daily activities. And it's definitely needed for them to access the activities that we have on campus. Okay. So just a reminder. Anything else?
No. We'll just ask Christy if there's any questions in the chat.
Is there
before
some?
we get to emotion?
We do. We have
Okay.
several questions. So I've been kind of typing them out over here so I could ask you. So I'm trying to kind of put them in a logical order here. One would be, you talked about how service animals are dogs or miniature horses. So can you explain why someone might have a miniature horse as a service animal?
That is a really good question, and the answer is kind of surprising. But what we've learned about miniature horses and why that's even allowed is that miniature horses, one, have a longer lifespan. And so you saw the one slide in there that Julie talked about, being the cost of training a service animal is really quite high in many cases. And if of course, if the longevity is longer with an animal, it's much better to have that service animal live a little longer and be able to do that. They're also very smart and easily trainable. So that's why the miniature horse is one of the options of a service animal.
Awesome. And we had a question, you answered it a little bit, but I think maybe a little bit more about what if an animal is unruly or disruptive? So what should someone do?
Sure. So depending on where they are, it really, if it's disruptive of your class, you can just say, ask them if you could talk to them really quick and say, look, is this normal? We can't have this, this is distraction to our other students. We really need you to maybe find somebody to come get them while you're in class, or we need to figure out something. You want me to send you the notes, something to work with them. Sometimes dogs are just having a bad day, and or they're not trained up yet, or you just never know what's going on. If they're trained very well, then you more than likely won't see that. But I would think that you would just need to contact the person who's the owner and just say, hey, this is too disruptive for the class. We need to figure out what to do. It's probably very inconvenient when you're having to do it in the middle of a class, but you don't want your other students to suffer, and you don't want that person to suffer either, not being able to be attentive to the material that's being covered. Now, if it's an employee, it's a little bit easier. You can go behind closed doors, and you would probably want to talk to the person maybe out in the hallway anyway, just so that you can have a conversation. But talk to the employee saying, hey, this is disrupting. This is what can we do? Do you need to take them outside? Do you, how can we remedy this? Because we can't continue to have this disruption. But it's just a very needed conversation. And this ADA process is very supportive of an interactive process. And that's really keeping communications open between that person with the service animal or anyone who has a disability and who their supervisor or
right.
Yeah,
or
manager. Yeah. Or professor.
Great, thanks. And then what if there is either a student in the class where there's a service animal, or in an employment setting, someone in the office who has an allergy and is having reactions to a service animal? What do you do in those situations?
Okay, so we're going to go over that a little later.
Perfect.
So
Right.
we'll keep that until the end, or we get to that.
Okay, but the short answer is the interactive process that she was just referring to. That's there's not a one size fits all answer to that question.
Yes,
right.
But that happens. That happens.
Yeah, it definitely does.
So we'll tell you how to handle that.
Perfect. We have a few more. So a question about what is to prevent students from bringing pets into buildings. So I know we've probably all seen people other places off campus that we've seen dogs that we don't think probably are service animals, but when it happens on campus, like what is there anything that someone could do, because it seems like there's really no recourse for someone bringing a dog into a building.
Right, there is the very last slide I referred to earlier about some of the rules and regs. There is a student rule on pets, and there is a university SAP, a standard administrative procedure, that talks about pets. And so what you could do is, if that person with the pet is coming into the building, you could ask them the two questions that we talked about earlier about, is this a animal that's for a person with a disability, and then is it trained to do a task? If the answers are no, you can say that that animal is not allowed in the building, please remove them. So you can actually ask them to remove the dog or the pet.
Right. And that leads a little bit to the next question, which I think maybe is from, if I say I had a service animal and someone asked me the question. So if someone said, is this a service animal? And I said yes. And then they asked the second question, what is the animal trained to do? So should I just list what the animal is trained to do, or is there anything specific that if I was a service animal handler that I should say?
If you were the owner or the handler of that animal, and especially if it's one in training, you could list one or two of the tasks, as long as it relates to that person, your disability, and that should be all you need to list. As long as it makes sense. It's like if you just said, though, it gives me comfort, that's not going to be a task, and it won't be a good answer. And that person, you could be asked to have your animal removed from the building.
Great. Great point. And I think that whole task thing, sometimes people get confused, but it's got to actively do something. That sometimes helps me keep it straight in my mind, is it has to be actively doing something. So not just be there. And you may cover that a little bit more as we move into emotional support animals. And then we had a question about if, I think this is a little bit answered maybe, and it's going to go back to interactive process, but if there was a nurse or a nursing student or a doctor or somebody in the medical field who has a service dog, like how would this work? And then is the patient's room considered a publicly accessible area?
It gets into employment laws if you want to answer them. It depends, are you in academic or employment? So you've got two different things going on here.
So any employee of A&M, regardless of who they are, would go through the interactive process to request an accommodation. But service animals can go with them. I mean, they're working with them and performing tasks. The public access is for people who are coming into a program or service, okay? The people who are employees have their service dogs, and those have already been established as a reasonable accommodations, and they follow them because they do their tasks. So they're both acceptable. Now, depending on where they are, if the doctor is in there with, performing surgery, that's part of the interactive process. How is that affecting what's happening in that area? And then we would have to figure out what to do at that point. But when it's an employee and the area is somewhat not public and there's concerns, then the interactive process would be engaged. So to make sure that everybody's safe. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. I think a big piece to it, and I think Julie, you were the one that said it, is just that the case-by-case basis.
Yes.
So it's very complicated, and it's going to get more complicated as they keep talking. But we've worked through some situations with students where we had to look at every situation they were going to be in to figure out where the service animal was okay to be and where not, and then if not, what other accommodation could be provided. So it's really looking at what's the service animal doing. Is there another way to accomplish that if it's not safe for them to be there? And it's really looking very specifically at different environments, not just saying, as you said, it's a lab, so service animals aren't allowed. That's not the case. It's looking really specifically about that environment and what's needed. So it can be a very case-by-case kind of situation. So in this nurse example, I think it's going to rely on that interactive process like you talked about.
Right, and there are a lot of different options that are available for exploration and conversation. And like you said, Christy, in one case, the animal might be able to stand by the doorway if it's close enough to still be able to do the task at hand. In other cases, they might be able to look through a window, or it just depends. So you really have to do it on a case-by-case basis, not just on that person, but on their individual experiences as they go throughout their day. Especially, and you do have, there's a little bit of difference between employee and student, and what we can do and what process we go through. So good question. Great.
Okay, I think we're going to continue on because I know you have some other really important information to share.
Okay.
Okay, so emotional support animals, we call them ESAs throughout the presentation, are domesticated animals, and it's not limited to dogs or miniature horses. They're not considered a service animal. They're not trained to perform a task. They're just providing comfort or emotional stability by just existing and being around their human. They're not doing anything else but just being there. Does not have the same access as service animals. And they do not have the legal right to be in a classroom or in another building. This is emotional support animals, as we'll talk about a little bit later, or for housing. They are required, or they can be required when you're living in a dorm or apartment or some type of public housing. So let's see.
Anything else on that one?
Okay, so the only place, and before we get to this, the only place that an ESA has absolute right to be is in housing, which means that the Fair Housing Act adopted or allows for them to be in housing with their human when someone has requested that from the house, whoever is providing the housing. It's not automatic either. They've got to make a request from the provider. They have to give supporting documentation by a reliable disability physician or someone who knows something about their disability, and confirm that there's a need for the animal. And the housing provider, let's see, will make sure that it's not imposing an undue financial or administrative burden as a part of their review, that it would not fundamentally alter their housing that they're providing, and that it does not pose a direct threat to the health or safety of the occupants or others. So when that is, not in play, then, and they've provided the documentation that's necessary, then they will need to allow the emotionally support animal into the dorm or the apartment or that housing facility. This is in accordance with that, Fair Housing Act. And this is also in spite of any rule that you can't have pets in one of these facilities. The housing facility cannot charge an extra fee unless the animal causes damage to the property. So it's just like it's an extension of this person that's going to be living there. Hotels and Airbnbs aren't covered by the fair housing rules, so they're not required to allow ESAs, or at least that's the last time I checked. Restaurants and stores, there's no requirement to let them in there either. I had a note here that in January of 2021, the U.S. Department of Transportation, because of regulatory changes, stopped allowing emotional support animals on flights. I don't know if some flights are still, or some airlines are still allowing that or not, but that was my latest note on that.
I think they got a little, some interesting cases when people start bringing chickens and peacocks and other types of animals. So
yes, yeah. and so anyway, so those are required in the housing area, but not in our buildings and not in our classrooms.
So as a general rule, support our service animals are allowed in anywhere the person with a disability goes. Emotional support animals are not allowed in buildings on campus except for housing, and we do have residence halls and apartments on campus. So, but they do have to go through a process before they're allowed to stay with their owners.
And there again, with the ESAs, the owners are responsible for damages, and they must keep them under control. And make sure that they're not a disruption or barking in that environment, or they can be asked to leave as well. We had something funny happen. I think there was a cat that was in one of the dorms, and people were coming in to do some work, and the cat would just bolt out of the dorm room. So where they're not really having to keep them in control when they're in the room, there might be times where they do need to keep them in control in the room when we've got people going in there to do some work. But anyway, ESAs, we have ESAs in our dorms and in our apartments. So what's the request process for this? Student requests that are housing related go to Residence Life. And I think they work with you guys, Christy, right? And determine, how that's gonna, the process for that. Other requests go to disability resources when it's a student, and they'll go through a normal process of reviewing that. Employee requests go through the ADA request for reasonable accommodation process, which is, we've put a link to our SAP, and that goes through the HR liaison and HR goes through a process for that too. Visitor requests. So someone comes on campus and there's a university sponsor of the event or the activity that may have put something on their flyer that says, if you need an accommodation, contact us. When they get so they'll get requests for activities and events. And at any point, if any of these requests are needing an extra review, they'll contact our office and we will just work through whatever we need to do just to see if it's reasonable or not.
So it's general rule, service animals get to come on campus and access the buildings and facilities. Emotional support animals do need to go through and kind of a request and approval process before they are accessing the university facilities. Yeah. Which then brings us to pets.
Yes. So then we have our pets, which are the other set of animals on our campus. They're not allowed in the housing facilities or in the public facilities in any of our buildings. They must be kept under control on a leash, no aggressive behavior, no disruption, no damage, can't roam free in any of our open areas, and the owner is responsible for damages there too. So we have animals out on Research Park, people walking around on the weekends, even during in the afternoons, and those are the animals that we're talking about. They should, sometimes you'll see dogs chasing after Frisbees. That's really not supposed to happen. They're supposed to be on a leash, even if they're, very obedient and under someone's control. They're still supposed to be on a leash if they're on campus. It's according to our rules. Anything?
Were there any questions, Christy, on that?
Oh.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions, and I wanted to provide one clarification. So if it's a student who has a request for an emotional support animal in housing, that actually goes through, the request goes through our office, so through Disability Resources, and we will either approve or deny the request, and then Housing or Residence Life works with them on making sure they get their vaccination records. They explain to them the rules. They have on file that they have an ESA. So it is a joint effort, but it kind of starts with our office making that call. So we're the one that actually gets the documentation so that it's in a secure place, and we're the experts on that. So that's just kind of a clarification. We definitely work together, but it usually starts with us.
Okay, I'll make sure I change. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. And I put a link to we added recently more information about emotional support animals on our website because we were getting a lot of not appropriate documentation. So we put a little bit more information on our website. So I put a link to that there. And then we did have a question about whether an ESA is allowed in the library or classrooms if the professor allows it.
No, no, the professors shouldn't be allowing it. The answer is no.
Good answer, good answer.
Yeah.
I will say, I know on the other slide, it did say other requests go to Disability Resources. So if a student is requesting an emotional support animal to be taken somewhere besides housing, that is an accommodation request that we would consider through our office. So it's not something that we do very often, but it is something that we request, and it could be an accommodation for a student just based on their disability and the information we have and all of that. So that was in the slide. I just wanted to kind of point that out a little bit further. So
No, that's an important distinction too, because an ESA can be an accommodation for a person with a disability. It doesn't have to be a service animal, but they could be an accommodation. So if it makes, if it goes through the process and it's approved by Disability Resources, like you said, there's probably in the several years, 20-something years, a handful that would be allowed in the classroom, but it's typically not allowed. But there are always, like I said, case by case basis that you never know what's the best accommodation for that student.
right, and then they would actually have a letter from our office that said that was an accommodation. So it's not a professor's decision, but it is something that we could approve. But again, very, very rarely.
And we would never really want to prevent somebody from asking for anything.
Right.
Let's go through the process, and then we'll figure out what is appropriate.
Right. Right. Yeah. And Tracy Foreman and from my office made the point also just that that's only for on-campus housing. So just in case, every once in a while we'll get a student who submits something to our office wanting us to confirm that a student needed an emotional support animal, but they live in an apartment off campus. And we don't have anything to do with that. If they want an emotional support animal to off-campus housing, that goes directly to their landlord, not through our office.
Yeah, and that landlord could have a totally different process. We don't know what those processes are.
Right.
Right.
I think that's the main questions. Does anyone else have any questions that they want to share? Don't see anything right now. We did have a little clarification about, again, about emotional support animals and service animals. Whether a dog is an emotional support animal or a service animal isn't based on what the person's disability is.
Correct.
It's based on what the animal is doing. So if they're actively doing a task related to the disability, then they're a service animal and they were trained to do it. If they just provide comfort, as I think the word Peggy used, they just make the person feel better. They're calming because they're there. The person can pet them and they feel better. That's not active, and that would be an emotional support animal, not a service animal. So that was a clarification that kind of went through the chat also.
Okay, so what do you do if there are? Okay, so this is where we're going to come up. We're going to be able to answer some of the questions that you guys are seeing out in the areas. Multiple service dogs in a space. Okay, it happens. We had 3 in a classroom several years ago. You remember that, Christy? We had one that was in training, one that was a service dog, and another one that someone said was an ESA, but then ended up being another service dog. So it's not, you just have to work it out. They're all required to be there. They are all permitted to be there. We just have to work out how that works. We don't want a dog to be distracted from doing their task by another dog. So if we could just figure out, where the spacing needs to be to make sure everybody's safe and doing what they're supposed to do, then that's what needs to happen. If there's a problem, sometimes there's not a problem. Sometimes you got 2 of them in there and they're perfectly fine. They might be sitting by each other, still able to perform their tasks and no problems. But if it comes to your attention by one of them, then we need to figure out what to do.
And it's very easy if one of the dogs is distracting to the other dog or not, minding its manners, so to speak. If it's laying in the middle of the aisleway where people are trying to walk over, there you can work with the owner to bring the animal more better under control. And if that doesn't work, then we'll have to figure out something else to do for that person. So is that good on that question? Mm-hmm. All right. So what about someone who has a fear of dogs or fear of this big service dog?
Okay. So it's not a sufficient reason to prohibit the accommodation of the service dog. You possibly could have 2 people that need accommodations. One has the service dog and the other one has a big fear of dogs. That person could request an accommodation by going to their physician and getting a medical certification and requesting that they be moved a certain place, or able to shut their door, or you know, during certain times, maybe flex when they come in and when they leave so that they don't see a dog. Things can be worked out. So it's all part of that interactive process there, because you might have two people with disabilities at that point and they both need to be accommodated.
Right.
Same thing with someone who has an allergy. It's the same thing. You could have two different disabilities. You've got someone who is dreadfully allergic to dogs. Their throats close up. They can't be in the same area. What can we do? Do we need to have an air filter? Do we need to put them in different areas? What is available? But that also has to go through the request for accommodation process if you are the person who's allergic to a dog, so that both of you can be accommodated and to make sure that, you know, you're taken care of.
Right. And we did talk about this one a little bit earlier about if you have a service dog and say it's in training or just having a bad day, as Julie said, and it's barking or really restless and just making a lot of noise while either in a classroom or in maybe your work office environment. You know, what can you do there? That's where if you're the professor in the classroom, you could ask the person with the disability to see if they can get the dog under control. If they cannot, then you can ask them to remove the dog, you know, and however that they can work that out. If you're in the work environment, again, if it's barking, disruptive, you can ask your employee to ask again, see if they can get the dog under control. If they're not able to do that, then ask them to take the dog out of that work environment. You know, it doesn't mean that they can never come back, you know, go back, work on the training, work on those things, and then the dog is always welcome back after it can be under control a little bit better. Okay. So we kind of talked about this one a little bit too. If let's say a student brings a service dog to a research lab, you know, that's kind of a wide open scenario. Research labs can contain, I mean, that's really wide what we're talking about. So if it's a medical research, or if it's, you know, you're talking about, you know, microns or whatever it is, or if you're just talking about, you know, other, you know, human behavior type research. So it just depends on what it is. And we kind of touched on this earlier, really case by case, just to see what can we do? Can that research lab accommodate the service dog to be in that lab, or do we need to figure out another couple, you know, come up with other options to accommodate the person with the disability and the things that are going on in that lab, especially if it's that really sterile environment that we can't bring an animal into. We have had cases even where we talk about an animal can be dressed up, you know, or accommodated by wearing the PPE. So if you think about it, if we have to wear a hairnet, can the dog wear a net or some kind of thing on its around it? Will it tolerate that? You know, there's options, you know, if they need to have, you know, like Julie mentioned earlier, goggles, some kind of eye protection, will the dog be able to, you know, do that? Does it need to get trained to wear the goggles and then be able to come into the lab? So there's lots of options. We never say no, but we try to always think about other options that we can explore.
I don't know if I said this before, but if the lab has something that they're willing to give to the dog to use or to try, then they can. But really the onus to purchase PPE for the dog is the owner or handler. Those are, that's a personal service animal. So they are on the hook for those expenses that are associated with that, if that lab doesn't have anything that they can share or are willing to share.
And then we've really talked a lot about classrooms. We've talked about labs. We've talked about housing. We haven't really talked about other activities on campus. You know, we've got athletic stadiums. We've got, you know, musicals on campus with Opus. We've got different things that people bring things to. What do we do if we bring service animals and to these activities? You know, activities. Typically the service animal, like we said, has access to attend with their handlers, the person with the disability. They can sit in front of them. If there's space, they can actually be right in front of them where their feet are or underneath the chairs. Same as a person with a disability in a wheelchair, we have some extra space. Maybe we need to set them in the space where there's some extra space for like wheelchair accessibility. So there's different places, but we never say no. We'll make sure that we have that person has access to be able to participate in the activity.
And ADA does allow for someone who has a service dog to change from a non-accessible chair or seat to an accessible seat in an event when they have a service dog that needs some room.
So one thing we haven't really talked a lot about, and we talk about service animals, and we're that they're required by law to be accessible at our throughout an A&M and the facilities on campus. We talked about emotional support animals, but really when I talk about having pets and ESAs, and then we also have our service animals, we always have the question of someone saying, I don't think that that person really a service animal, even though they answered yes, I'm just still not sure, or I think they're falsifying that. And so we have gotten questions about that, and they, we hate to have that even as a possibility. It just is there are consequences, other than the last bullet on there. It talks about a misdemeanor. You could have a fine of falsely saying that you have a service animal. It's not really a service animal, up to like $300 fine, and you could have some community service. But we really, from the ADA standpoint, we want to make sure people have accessible, that they can participate in our activities and our programs. And we don't want the person that has a true service dog that is doing a task to be, bombarded with questions anytime they enter a facility, just because there's been so many people that have brought in their pets and their dogs, and it's just a free-for-all at that point. And we don't want to have an added discrimination or bias or detriment to those folks that really need the service animal. So we do want to just be conscious of treating those with the disability with respect, and make sure that we don't have a lot of people bringing in their animals and saying that they're service animal because they just really want their pet with them. And because it does bring them comfort, but we do want to have that differentiation between a service animal and then other animals. Christy, before I go to the next slide, are there any other questions? No? Okay. So with that, I know that everybody's on the edge of their seats for this slide, because this is the slide that if you really want to know more about it, you can delve in. So really just that, if you the links to a couple of different things, just to give you the Fair Housing Act that Julie mentioned, that allows ESAs in housing. There's a link there to more information about that. There's the link to Americans for Disabilities Act. There's also some FAQs related to that are really good. They're easy to read, fast and easy. There's 2 SAPs there, the University Standard Administrative Procedure, or SAP. So there's one on service animals, and I know somebody asked about pets. It's 2. It talks about that in there as well. And also then, if as an employer, how do people ask for or request accommodations? There's a SAP on that. That's the second one. And then we have some FAQs, and I know this disability resources. You've got some information on your webpage as well. And then the last one is that pets rule that we mentioned earlier. So if people want to look at what the student rule relating to pets are, that's the rule that you can show as your governance or guidance on that. Okay.
I did ask if there were other questions, but we do have one person who I think wanted to unmute and tell a little bit about an experience with service dogs kind of coming into contact, and it sounds like it might be helpful for the group. So Zara, I think you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Zara. Sorry, there's like a filter on here, but my service dog, her name is Chicken. We've had an interaction, and she's in training, but we've had an interaction where another service dog in training actually walked up to Chicken. And of course, that's distracting for Chicken and the other service dog. And so instead of creating any kind of conflict, it was just simply like, okay, Chicken, let's just go. And even though we were the ones who were sitting down, we got up and we moved our spot. And so as like Chicken's in training, and she's just like curious about other dogs, we try to study now in places that are very far apart. MSC is a really good spot because if someone has another service dog that they're walking, Chicken won't get distracted by them, or it's farther apart that if one of them happens to bark, we can easily be like, no, don't bark, let's walk away or go outside or something. And I feel like that's just an easy way to avoid conflict between service dogs.
Very good.
Thank you. That's really, I appreciate you doing that, because especially with dogs in training, they can't do the task, they can't learn it unless they get trained to do it. So, and we have to bring them out in public, and we have to be able to have those experiences so you can teach them the right things. And I appreciate you being able to be flexible and to move where you can. And, you know, sometimes you can't, but when you can, you do that. So I appreciate and applaud you for that. Thank you for doing that. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we have, you know, with any presentation or speech or anything you do that, you have your intro that you have, and you tell people what you want to cover, and then you have the things that you want to say and the topics and the information you want to provide, and we've done that. And then you have the conclusion or the summary at the end. So our summary at the end is, we picked 5 questions, and this is going to be your summary, so your takeaways for today. So the first, we're going to do some questions, and Christy, we're going to do, people can put it in the their answers in the chat if they want, but they don't have to. People are not going to get graded on this, and we won't say, you know, how many you get right and how many you don't. But so we're just going to do, we have like, I think 5 questions or so. So the question number 1 is, only dogs, and in some cases miniature horses, are recognized as service animals under the ADA. So is that true or false? And Christy, tell me how many, what the majority is what you're seeing. People want to put their answer in the chat.
They are saying true. I don't see any falses.
Okay, so as a cat owner, I would love for my cat to be a service animal, but he is not trainable. He does his own thing. So that you are right. Everybody said true is correct. Correct. Question number 2 then, true or false? Emotional support animals are allowed in A&M buildings under the ADA. True or false?
So we're seeing lots of falses.
Okay, so that is a correct answer. False is a correct answer. And it's kind of a tricky question too, because we do have the Fair Housing Act that does allow ESAs in housing. But as a general rule, ESAs are not allowed in buildings under the ADA. So good job. Good job, everyone. Okay, question number 3, true or false? Service animals must wear a vest to show others or identify that they are a service animal.
They're jumping on that one fast.
Good deal.
Almost everybody says false. They were listening on that part.
There you go. That's the correct answer. Yeah, and you know, that's the thing is sometimes, you know, when A&M was looking at updating and revising their SAP on service animals and ESAs and pets on campus, that one SAP we referred to earlier, there was a question or comment: should we have people that bring service animals on campus wear something that identifies them as a service animal? And the answer was we cannot do it by law. They cannot require somebody to do that or have an animal wear that. So that's actually by law. Okay, question number 4 then. So a student, true or false, a student walks into the MSC with Mittens, the Maltese. The 2 questions you can ask the student about their dog to determine if it's a service animal are, is the service animal required because of a disability, and what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? So is that true or false? Is this a trick question or not?
Okay, I see almost all true so far.
Okay, the answer is true. I didn't want to trick you on this because I actually wanted to make sure you had this as a resource in case you ever wanted to go back to it and say, what are my 2 questions I can ask? So yes, and that little dog Mittens there is my sister's dog, cute as a bug, and is not trained to do anything, so it's not a service animal. But yeah, that's one of those things. But a Maltese can be trained to do a task. So you might see a small dog like that and actually be a service animal, and it may or may not be wearing a vest or anything marking that.
Yeah,
And then
real quick, Peggy and Julie, Zara asked, isn't it is a service animal? I'm a little confused by the question, but I think maybe they're saying because it's a service animal, can you not ask the question? But you can always ask the question. And as
Well-
long as they say yes, and as long as they provide the answers, then it is a service animal and they're fine.
Right. So in this scenario, the MSC is an A&M building and it's not allowed to have any other pets or animals in there. So if a person walks in with an animal, mittens here, you can maybe make the assumption that they're assuming that it's a service animal. So if you're trying to determine if it's allowable here in the building and you're trying to determine if it is a service animal, if the answers are yes, it's a service animal and on you go. If the answers are no, then the person needs to remove the animal from the MSC.
And maybe one point to make there, I'm not sure if this is the point, but is who should be asking those questions. So if I'm a student or a staff member and I'm just in a building, I have no responsibility for that building. It's really not, if there's somebody with a dog, I really don't have a reason to be asking those questions. But if it's someone in the building I work with, or I'm the building proctor, or there's a reason for me to be asking, I think my point is, students don't need to go around asking each other these questions to determine. It's not your place to determine if it's a service animal or not. But as a staff member or a faculty member, that might be a more appropriate person to ask those questions. I don't know if that helps with Zara's question.
And it might also too, but even if you're a student and you're being really distracted, maybe you're trying to study in a spot and Mittens is right there and all over the place and wagging its tail and going in and out of the walkways, you might want to ask, you could ask the person with the disability or with Mittens, or you could go find the building proctor or somebody that's in charge of, if that's the right word, the space. It would probably be easier to ask somebody that's in charge of the space. But if nobody's around and they're really distracting you, you probably could ask that.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's where I think we've seen a little bit, when we developed the service animal awareness program, was because there were students who were feeling like they were getting a little harassed about their service animals. So it's how you ask the question sometimes can feel threatening or can feel very accusatory. So that's where it's a little bit difficult sometimes. If you are not comfortable with asking the questions, you don't know what you're asking, that maybe it's better not to ask.
Right. Okay. And then our last question, and we talked about service animals being allowed in the public areas of A&M then. So places that offer public accommodation must assist individuals with the service animal by providing water for the animal and offering a relief area. Okay, so we're a large campus. Is that true or false?
So we're seeing lots of falses.
That is the right answer. We, as a university or even as an employer, we're not required to, have the things that an animal needs. That's up to the owner, the handler, the person with the disability to provide. So they'll carry water, they'll carry, relief areas. They sometimes have little relief pads or pee pads or whatever you call them, and they'll bring that with them depending on how long the length is inside a building. They have their dog trained for certain time frames, and that's part of the training that goes involved in that. Okay. So with that, that's our last question. So I think looks like everybody passes with flying colors. Everybody gets an A, 100% on that. And so we just want, if anybody has any other other questions, we're happy to field them. Was there anything else in the chat, Christy? No? Okay, good.
I don't know how we got so close to 3 o'clock. How that even happened.
Mhm.
We're so good.
Aggie, Julie, y'all did a phenomenal job, and we just thank you for taking the time to walk us through service animals and emotional support animals, and answering so many questions, several questions we've had in the Aggie Disability Awareness Workshop as well. And so I'm so thankful for your time and that we have this presentation and you here at the university. So thank you guys for being here and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Megan, real quick, we had a couple of questions about the presentation recording and the slides. So
Great.
those will be on the website.
Great
Right?
question. I will be posting the website in the chat function in a moment. But if you Google accessibility in Aggieland, you will find it. But we have the presentation right now up on the website, and then we will have the recording up probably by Friday afternoon. And we'd love it if you guys would share this information. Oh, thank you, Christy. We'd love it if you share the information with your colleagues. We have quite a few other workshops in our on our website that you can go back and watch. And very importantly, we also have an evaluation link that we just shared in the chat function. And I would love it. And I know Chrissy would love it. And Julie and Peggy would love it if you would take a minute to click on that evaluation link and just give us some feedback. We use this information just to help improve this webinar series, and we'd love to hear what you thought, what ideas you have for future webinars, so that we can share with our presenters and our team. But thank you again, everyone, for being here. Julie, Margaret, do you have any final words?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to present on it and just increase that awareness and let people know about it. And so I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys so much. It was wonderful. Bye, everyone. Have a fabulous day.
Thank you.